And welcome back. If you are joining us right now, our second conversation is all about the OSH Bill. Joining us in studio to talk all about it is the president of the Belize Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Mr. Marcelo Brake. Good morning, Mr. Marcelo.
Morning.
And the president of the National Trade Union Congress of Belize, Mr. Luke Martinez. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning, gentlemen.
All right. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of the OSH Bill, it is up for review. Yes. And of course, you both are supposed to be members of that reviewing committee. Let's talk about why now have they put up a committee to review this OSH Bill. Mr. Marcelo?
Why now? It's been years. I mean, the first bill was introduced back in 2014. And of course, we, as a chamber, had provided our inputs back then. And since then, we've had a good working relationship with the NTUCB in making revisions, edits, recommendations to the government. So the request at this time for a review by another committee seems a little bit off-placed, so to speak, because we've been working on this for so many years in trying to make sure that this bill comes to fruition and is actually passed. It was, I think, 2019 where we set up with the NTUCB a joint committee to look at the bill. And then set up a technical committee off of that to kind of go through it line by line, making as many recommendations, changes, edits as possible. And so we made those submissions back in, I believe it would have been August of 2022 to the ministry to be able to put on the table the joint position. Well, actually, it's a tripartite position because we must mention that in that joint committee, the government had a presence in that. So it was the NTUCB, the Chamber of Commerce, as well as the government that formed that working joint committee to be able to start making necessary edits to the bill. Those were submitted, and so the hope was that with all that work put in for many, many months, that in fact the government would have then looked at it in a more favorable light to be able to say, okay, minor tweaks here and there, but let's get the bill moving.
Let's take a step back for some of our viewers that might not be aware of the content of the bill and why it was important for you both and as well as other parties to review the content of that bill. Mr. Martinez.
So I want to go back to why, to the why now, and then we advance to the second question. First of all, I think that is something that the Minister of Labour would need to answer. And for us, as a workers' representative, this is something that needs to happen a long time ago. Workers, we continue to get injured. We're dying on the job. And so it is something that needs to happen. We've done our part and we continue to do our part, as stated by the BCCI president, where we had worked jointly, including representation from the Ministry of Labour, who had input. So it's not as if though we were trying to discover something new. Our expectation would have been, once we had submitted the finalized work, the ministry would have then forwarded the bill to the Labour Advisory Board. We'd have done our review to it and make recommendations to the CEO to then advance that to Cabinet and then to the National Assembly. The ministry sees that there's a need for us to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. And they're saying that they want to cover their tracks and ensure that they consult stakeholders on what are the changes. Fine. Reluctantly and very reluctantly, the National Trade Union Congress is going to participate. And why reluctantly? Because we believe that it is something that should have done long time ago.
That would have been my question. I mean, occupational safety and health, right, is something that affects all of us as employers and as employees.
And customers.
And customers across the board.
Yes.
Something like this, in my opinion, should have been dealt with a long time ago. It should have been slam bam, thank you ma'am, put it into effect, right? Why, for whatever reason, it has been dragged out to where it is it's beyond me.
One of the biggest one of the biggest concerns we keep hearing, and for me, I've been following this since 2014. Indeed, I was working at the National Assembly when this bill was passed, and so as
not passed.
Presented.
yeah,
Presented.
sorry, I
Yeah.
went past. Yes, when it was presented, yes, thanks very much. Yes, so when it was presented in 2014, I was working at the National Assembly, and as a staff at the National Assembly, we had to take minutes, and we went on countrywide consultation.
Yeah.
And one of the biggest concern at that time was casting to the employers, right? Fast forward to now, that is not going to change,
Yeah.
right? What is going to change is that we're going to be working in a safe environment, right? And most people have this misconception that the bill is only going to have a cast on the employers, and that workers will be getting a free ride. No, this bill also holds workers responsible for their actions. So if you're not, if you're negligent on the job, then you also have a culpa.
Yeah.
You have to take responsibility. So it holds workers responsible
Yeah.
that they are safe, they are working in a safe environment, and that I am protecting this person who I am working with.
Yeah.
And that was part of the review where at many times we had varying opinions on what needed to be
Yeah.
in there.
Yeah.
Looking at cost was one for sure, but also looking at the, as you said, the culpability of an employee not utilizing what has been provided by the employer. Because in many cases, you provide all the safety equipment, PPEs and what have you, but how do you get an employee to ensure that they're utilizing what's been provided, and that doesn't then spin back to the employer as a negative?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because if an incident should occur, obviously then the first person they're looking to is the employer.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, I'm looking at the need for policies within these respective places of employ and being able to adhere to the policies. So for argument's sake, if you're in a job where you're required to wear a hard hat, for instance, you're in a construction site or you're in a mechanic room or what have you, and you have to be properly attired for that, then there's a certain policy that says, okay, this is the expectation of you, the employee, considering the fact that the employer has now provided all the resources you need for you to be safe. So this is the policy. You need to be able to wear your hard hat at all times, put on your PPE material, what have you. But from my point of view, oftentimes I see that companies provide all of these resources and they don't see to it that they're followed through. So sometimes people do something in respect of the policy, and sometimes they don't. So it's almost as if there's a situation where you don't have proper enforcement, right?
And the onus of that, I mean, I will have to say falls on the employer in making
Yeah.
sure that you have these safety coordinators or somebody who's responsible to be able to check,
Yeah.
to ensure that all your fellow colleagues are doing what they're supposed to do. It's similar to when COVID was in place and you had to put that additional person in place to
Yeah.
make sure that people were sanitizing, washing their hands, and everything else that comes with protecting
Yeah.
individuals.
But it also comes back to, with non-enforcement, it also comes back to what employers know are their rights within a workspace and what they don't know. Many times you have places that do have an employee manual, but come on, how often do people read it, and how often are they reviewed together with the employee and the employer?
Yeah.
Right?
So the whole thing is we'll have to have a culture shift.
Right.
But it comes with awareness and sensitization. Clearly, we'd have to have companies stepping up their OSH certification. You'd have workers who would, on their own, also go and find some of these courses, and us at the NTUCB would have to do some tweaking in our education department, where we'd offer, as a matter of fact, right now as we speak, through the Cipriani College of Labor in Trinidad. We have at least one person right now who is certifying OSH.
Okay.
So we're preparing ourselves. It requires a serious culture shift.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we'd have to, and we've mentioned to the ministry that the sensitization has to also, they need to communicate with schools, right? So the education sector has to be on board,
Yeah.
whereby from at high school and university, you know what are your responsibilities as workers and as employers. Look, this bill is a wonderful bill, right? Because there's also room for us to have a national OSH policy. So you'd have in your business, you'll have your internal policy, but there's also a national OSH policy. As a matter of fact, we need to advance further than just look. And we're afraid that the government is going to do this. You want OSH? Say OSH, yeah? Right, and so we'll have to sustain with the sensitization. And I was getting to the point that in some countries within our jurisdiction, OSH is a fundamental right.
Yeah.
As a matter of fact, last year, the ILO passed OSH as a fundamental right. And Belize, as a signatory to ILO, must fall in line.
Yeah.
So there's no going around OSH. And hence our reason for continuing to say, rush the OSH. Right?
And it's ironic because rush the OSH sounds great, but it's the most delayed piece of,
And
of
again, why?
legislation to be passed.
Right?
Yeah.
Were there
And the thing
any?
is that, sorry, and there are so many companies that are already operating in Belize that have standards well beyond OSH for us to learn from, and that's where in the consultation and in our working groups we had the benefit of those persons providing their input and providing their insights to be able to make it a better bill. But I agree, the time has gone, we're 9 years waiting, right? 2014, 2023 on a bill, and with the recent situations we've seen in the last couple of weeks, I mean, it's more important now than ever, I think, for us to move ahead with this, because at the end of the day, people are losing their lives.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You
What would have
understand?
been some concerns or disagreements towards the draft of this bill?
Things like fines, qualifications of persons who would be considered to be inspectors or commissioners to review, because at the end of the day, I mean, no offense, but if you take somebody who does not have any kind of OSH certification to be a part of a committee that's reviewing an incident on a work site,
Yeah.
what are the requirements? And as an employer, how do you then combat, or what are your recourses in making sure that, you know, you're not being penalized when in fact you may have done all that you're supposed to do? So
Yeah.
you want to make sure that the persons in those positions are well qualified to be able to make those judgment calls. I'm trying to think some of the others. There are quite a number as we went through that very lengthy bill line by line, and there were hours of disagreements until we finally came to a point where there were certain things we agreed to disagree on, and there were at least a dozen still pending, but for the most part, most of the others we'd been able to come to a consensus on.
Can this be chalked up to the lack of political will, perhaps, if we could describe it as such? If you're looking at something that has been protracted, next year we'll make 10 years.
Yeah.
We'll be celebrating an anniversary for something that's yet to be put into practice, into effect.
Pisani, I've mentioned to the Minister of Labour, and I think including the Prime Minister, I mentioned to the Prime Minister that, and I'm glad that you raised the question of political will. Political will shouldn't be their problem. OSH is going to be a historic legislation. And so I've mentioned to them, be a part of history. It's going to be a historic legislation.
Yeah.
And we at the NTUCB are not going to stop. We will continue to push. We'll continue to sensitize our membership and get our members to be certified, so that, as the president of BCCI mentioned, that whenever you set up these committees, you want to ensure that we have experts. And so we are preparing to ensure that we'll have our sets of experts within the NTUCB. So political will, these governments have to forget about political will now. They really have to forget about I'm not a politician, so they probably say, but look, political will important to us. But it's also important to the voters also. So it is something that must happen.
I want to be able to segue briefly. I know our time is winding down. Now, in your capacity as the president of the NTUCB, a statement has also been issued with respect of the increase in allowances for telephones for CEOs and other ranking government officials. While I have you here on the set, let's get your response to that.
Please give me a glass of water. This is a very bitter pill for all of us to attempt to swallow. I've heard a former prime minister talking about a bitter cigar, or how tough some pills will be tough to swallow. The workers in this country have been tasked to take some very serious cuts. In the public sector, workers' wages were cut by 10%, and also their increments were put on hold.
Yes.
And while up to now, workers in the public sector, teachers, police, nurses, the people who are working hard, while we continue to sacrifice, say, an approval for telephone allowance to increase more than 100% from 250 to 600. I want to know how could the financial secretary and the cabinet secretary, how they could justify such an injustice. There's no justification. No justification. In BNTU's press release, the release is a very true statement that while you're setting up your increases, teachers, they starve. It's a reality. And when teachers starve, the students starve, because these teachers help to feed these students at school. Public officers, they starve, my brother. And when public officers starve, everybody starve, because public officers spend more money than anybody else in this country. Over 14,000 public officers, they starve, while just a few bourgeois are ensuring that they will get a telephone allowance increase. As a matter of fact,
it's obscene when you think of it.
Obscene, everything. We can't put a proper adjective to this action. We can't. It is outrightly disrespectful, not only to the workers in this country, but also it's on it to the taxpayers. The taxpayers, everybody. It's absolutely ridiculous. And in our press release, we've made an appeal, and we want to step it up this morning to a demand to Cabinet. Cabinet will meet tomorrow. And Cabinet must demand the Financial Secretary to rescind that approval. They must do that. And the teachers have made it plain and straight that the green machine ready. The public officers are ready. This morning I read a message that public officers are going to be wearing yellow today to stand up against that action.
Yeah.
And every Belizean must stand up, because your taxpayers, your hard-working taxpayers' dollars is being used to pay telephone allowance. And me and you know that you don't need $600 a month.
That's what on the
And
face
that's why
of
you
it
want
would
the
make it obscene, right?
justification,
You
right?
don't need
Yeah.
it. Remember that. We don't
Yeah.
need it. I communicate with several CEOs and ministers of cabinet, and I communicate with them via WhatsApp. I could show you
Even an international
via
call doesn't
via
require
WhatsApp,
that much.
and you have several other platforms where they continue to communicate. So what are they going to use this money for? Galavan? While people starve? There's no excuse for this. No excuse. They are completely defeating the purpose of todos ganamos, and this is being translated into todos pagamos, todos perdemos.
All right.
So we come back to the OSH Bill now.
Yes,
No, but it needed to be said, and that's why I'm glad that you brought it up, Isane. But it goes back, and it goes hand in hand with why we focus on this when we're kind of delaying something as important as the OSH Bill. So now it's going for another review, you said, with another committee. Has there been any conversation as to why they need another review? Is that something that has come up?
I don't know that we've received a formal explanation. We've received a letter of invite to each of our organizations to name a representative. And as President Luke has said, we have accepted with some resistance to be able to participate, but we had to make sure that we were at the table at the same time.
Right.
We've gone on doing this task for over 9 years. So it's not to give up at this point. But yes, there's a question mark as to why now and why another review if the work has been done already.
Were there any communications after you sent in your edits? Were there any conversations as to...
We did receive a blanket response back to each of our organizations, you know, acknowledging receipt of the document and the markup, but that's about it. I don't know that
No
we've gotten
questions,
any...
no remarks.
There was never a request for any, or at least we've not received a request to a meeting to have any conversation on what we've submitted jointly. And so we are now taken aback by the request for us to participate in yet another round of review and consultation.
What is left to look at this bill? What finalized touches, if you will, need to be reviewing that you think would perhaps come up in this next round, I would call it?
It's difficult to say. Like I said, there are about, my recollection, 10 to 12 points, which we've both not agreed to, meaning both our organizations. And maybe those might be those sticking points. But if that's the case, then why not focus your conversation around those areas? If, as the ministry, you're pushing for these new consultations and new review, that it's narrowed down already to those specific areas where all three parties, the tripartite, need to then review and agree, or at least come to a middle ground so that the bill can be moved forward.
Wow. So in light of all of this, expectations moving forward, I know we want a bill to be passed. What then happens if it's delayed for another year?
We don't think that
That will happen?
there will be any delays with
Okay.
the enactment of this
Yeah,
bill.
I think I'm hopeful, and the chamber is hopeful that because the ministry has taken this move, I mean, it's been 9 years. It was introduced 9 years ago, and now finally it's been moved to at least this consultation being spearheaded by the ministry. We are very hopeful that, in fact, this could easily be passed before the next fiscal year begins.
All right. Wonderful, gentlemen. Thank you both so much for joining us. I think this is an ongoing conversation. I could go on and on about it, but we only had 20 minutes. So thank you, gentlemen, so much for coming in. We will continue to have this discussion. I'm certain we will be talking about it more in the news pieces tonight or the week. Thank you both so much for coming in. We are going to take the break, and when we come back, it's all about the People's Democratic Movement. Stay with us. We'll be right back.